Theodora was born at the beginning of the 6th century in the vast and restless city of Constantinople, a place that had already stood for nearly 200 years as the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. It was a city of stone and water, surrounded by great walls that stretched for miles and overlooked the waves of the Bosporus, the Sea of Marmara, and the Golden Horn. At dawn, the city awoke with the sound of traders setting up their stalls in the markets, fishermen returning from the waters, and the steady footsteps of soldiers patrolling the gates. It was a city of wealth, ceremony, and splendor, yet also of poverty, noise, and desperation. It was within this complicated city that Theodora entered the world, not as the daughter of nobility, but as the child of an entertainer who worked among animals and performers in the hippodrome. Her father, Acacius, is remembered in scattered records as a bear keeper. The hippodrome was more than a racetrack. It was a vast arena where thousands of people gathered to watch chariot races, animal hunts, public ceremonies, and political demonstrations. Bears and other wild animals were brought into the arena for shows, and Acacius tended to these creatures, making sure they could be presented to the restless crowds. This was not a respected position, but it provided a livelihood, however modest. Her mother was connected to the theatre, likely as an actress or dancer, though in this period the word actress carried meanings very different from what it does today. Actresses performed dances, pantomimes, and comedies that were usually bawdy, coarse, and appealing to the rough humour of the crowd. They often lived closely linked with prostitution, because performance and sexual services were entangled in Byzantine entertainment. So Theodora grew up in a household shaped by spectacle, noise, and the applause or scorn of ordinary people. From her earliest years, she would have known the smell of the hippodrome, the cries of the crowd, the heat of the animals, and the instability of life lived on the margins of respectability. She was not a senator's child, nor the daughter of a merchant. She was a girl surrounded by performance, by actors and dancers, by handlers of beasts, and by those who sold laughter and excitement to the city's population. When her father died, her family's security became even more fragile. Sources describe how her mother, in desperation, brought her 3 daughters into the hippodrome to plead with the leaders of the racing factions, the Blues and the Greens, for help. These factions were not just sports clubs, they were political and social groups, each with its own networks of loyalty. To Upton, her mother begged for aid, and eventually one of the factions took them under its protection, but life was still precarious, and Theodora soon entered the stage herself, working as an actress from a very young age. The profession she entered was not glamorous. Performers in Constantinople's theatres were often ridiculed as little better than prostitutes, and in many cases the two occupations were joined. Theodora's performances would have included comic sketches, pantomimes, and dances designed to provoke laughter, excitement, or desire. The audiences were rowdy, sailors and labourers filling the seats, shouting, jeering, and demanding more. To make a living in this environment required wit, sharpness, and the ability to hold attention in a rough and unforgiving crowd. We are told, especially by Procopius in his Secret History, that she also worked as a prostitute during these years. Procopius, who despised her later in life, portrays her early years with venom, describing her in the harshest and most scandalous terms. It is important to remember that he was writing with malice, eager to smear her reputation. Still, even through exaggeration, it is clear that her early life was marked by hardship and by survival through whatever means were available to her. She travelled as part of her career, performing in cities as far as Antioch and Alexandria, living a life of instability, moving with troops, and depending on the generosity or cruelty of strangers. But sometime in her 20s, her life changed direction. She abandoned the theatre and the brothel and sought a quieter, more modest existence. She began working with wool, spinning and weaving, a trade associated with humble women of the city. Some accounts suggest she also experienced a religious conversion at this time, drawing closer to Christianity. Whether from exhaustion, disillusionment, or genuine spiritual searching, Theodora stepped away from her earlier way of life and attempted to live differently. It was during this period that she caught the attention of Justinian, the nephew of the reigning emperor Justin. Justinian was a man of enormous ambition. Born in the Balkans, he had risen through the ranks with the help of his uncle, who had come to power despite humble origins himself. Justinian was deeply interested in law, theology, administration, and military affairs. He dreamed of restoring the Roman Empire to its full glory, of bringing back lands that had been lost to barbarian kingdoms in the west, and of strengthening the empire's foundations in the east. When he met Theodora, she was not an obvious match for him. She was of low birth, a former actress with a scandalous past, and by law, women of such backgrounds were forbidden from marrying men of senatorial or imperial rank. Yet Justinian was captivated by her intelligence, her wit, and her strength. He admired her not only for her beauty, but for her sharp mind and her ability to converse with authority. Despite the disapproval of many at court, Justinian pursued her. In order to marry her, he went so far as to change the law. A decree was issued removing the ban on senators marrying former actresses. With the obstacle cleared, Justinian married Theodora in 525. Just 2 years later, when his uncle Justin died, Justinian ascended to the throne, and Theodora, the daughter of a bear-keeper and a woman who had once performed in bawdy comedies, became the empress of the Byzantine Empire. As empress, Theodora did not fade into the background. She was no ceremonial ornament beside her husband. Instead, she became his partner in rule. She sat beside him in the great palace, received ambassadors, and was consulted in matters of law and policy. Contemporary accounts make clear that she had significant influence on decisions, and that Justinian trusted her judgment. Her life in the palace would have been utterly different from her youth. Instead of smoky theatres and noisy taverns, she now moved through marble halls decorated with mosaics, pillars, and gilded ceilings. The great palace of Constantinople overlooked the sea, with courtyards, gardens, and chapels. She wore robes woven with gold thread, jewels from distant lands, and crowns heavy with pearls and emeralds. Ceremonies at court were carefully choreographed displays of hierarchy, with courtiers bowing, ambassadors prostrating, and rituals designed to emphasize the majesty of emperor and empress. But beyond the ceremony, Theodora was active in governance. She advocated for laws that improved the status of women. Prostitution was restricted, and measures were taken to prevent the trafficking of young girls. Brothels were closed in certain areas, and women were offered protection from abuse. Divorce laws were altered to make them more favorable to women, granting them rights they had not enjoyed before. Convents and safe houses were established where women could find refuge. One of the defining moments of her reign came in 532 during the Nika Revolt. The riot began in the Hippodrome, where her father had once worked and where she herself had once pleaded as a child. The two great factions, the Blues and the Greens, who usually supported the emperor or opposed him through demonstrations, turned violently against Justinian. The city erupted into chaos. Fires consumed buildings, mobs rampaged, and for several days the empire itself seemed in jeopardy. Justinian considered fleeing. His advisors urged him to abandon the palace and escape while he could. But it was Theodora who stood firm. According to Procopius, she addressed the gathering of officials with calm resolve. She declared that she would not flee, that imperial dignity was worth more than life itself, and that for her, the purple robes of royalty would make a fine burial shroud. Her words stiffened Justinian's resolve. He ordered his generals Belisarius and Mundus to crush the revolt. Troops entered the Hippodrome and slaughtered tens of thousands of rioters. The rebellion was ended, and Justinian remained on the throne, thanks in no small part to Theodora's unwavering courage. In the years that followed, she continued to shape policy. She supported the Monophysite faction of Christianity, a group declared heretical by the official Church of Constantinople. She offered protection to their leaders, housed them in the palace, and used her influence to shield them from persecution. This religious stance put her at odds with many in the Orthodox establishment, but it showed her determination to follow her convictions even when they were unpopular. Her charitable works included building institutions for women, ensuring food and shelter for the poor, and intervening in legal cases. Though sources differ in their portrayal of her, some praising her generosity, others denouncing her as ruthless, there is no question that she left an imprint on the empire's policies. Theodora's life was not long by modern standards. She died in 548 at about 48 years of age, likely of cancer. Her death left Justinian devastated. He never remarried, and he continued to honor her memory throughout his remaining years. He reigned until 565, but without her presence, the partnership that had defined the early decades of his rule was gone. And so Theodora's story, which had begun in the poorest corners of Constantinople, in the laughter and jeers of the theatre and the scorn of polite society, ended in the heart of empire, in the marble palaces where decisions were made for millions. She had risen from the margins to the throne, from a life of performance and survival to a role of influence, lawmaking and power. Her legacy endures in fragments of mosaic, such as the famous panel in the church of San Vitale in Ravenna, where she is depicted with crown and robes, surrounded by her attendants, holding a chalice, her gaze solemn and serene. That image, glittering in coloured glass, has outlived the sneers of her enemies and the accusations of her critics. It shows her as she wished to be remembered, not as an actress of the stage, but as an empress of Byzantium. Her journey remains one of the most remarkable in history, a reminder that the paths of power are not always reserved for the nobly born, and that strength, intelligence, and determination can lift even the most unlikely figures into places of lasting memory. And with that, the long tale of Theodora, from brothel woman to empress, comes gently to its close. The story of Justinian after the death of Theodora unfolds slowly, like the long shadow of evening stretching across the marble courtyards of Constantinople. Theodora, who had stood by his side for more than 2 decades, had been the sharpness in his counsel, the firmness in his moments of doubt, the quiet but unwavering presence that guided his decisions. When she passed away in the year 548, Justinian remained emperor, but he was not the same man. To understand this next stage of the Byzantine Empire, we must walk slowly, carefully, and in detail through the years that followed. The city itself was a character in his reign. Constantinople, perched between Europe and Asia, stood enclosed by mighty walls that had been expanded and fortified in earlier centuries. The Theodosian walls, stretching across the landward side of the city, were said to be unbreachable, with double lines of stone and towers at intervals. Beyond them lay villages, orchards and fields, but within them the city was dense with houses, churches, workshops and markets. It is said that nearly 500,000 people may have lived within Constantinople at its height, making it one of the largest cities of the world. The streets were narrow, often clogged with traffic of donkeys, carts and pedestrians. At the heart of the city stood the hippodrome, still the site of races, ceremonies and riots, and beside it the great palace, where Justinian continued to rule after Theodora's passing. Let us pause on daily life in the city, for this is as important as the grand campaigns. In the morning, bakers rose early to prepare loaves of bread. Much of the grain came from Egypt, shipped across the Mediterranean and unloaded at the harbours of the city. Bakers, working in public bakeries, produced bread that was distributed to citizens as part of the state's grain dole. In markets, merchants sold vegetables, fruits, meats and fish. The fishmongers in particular were known for their loud calls, advertising catches from the Bosporus or from the deeper waters of the Black Sea. Artisans worked in small shops, producing pottery, glass, fabrics and leather goods. Silk weaving was especially important, though until Justinian's reign, the empire had depended on imports from China. In time, however, he managed to establish silk production within Byzantine lands by acquiring silkworm eggs smuggled out of Asia. Water was carried through aqueducts into the city and stored in massive underground cisterns, some of which survive even today. These cisterns, with their long rows of stone columns, offered steady supply in times of drought or siege. Public baths, a Roman tradition, remained in use, though on a smaller scale than in earlier centuries, and above the city's skyline rose churches, the most magnificent of which was the Hagia Sophia, completed in 537, nearly a decade before Theodora's death, but still the jewel of Justinian's reign. The Hagia Sophia deserves its own slow description. It was built after the Nika revolt, when much of the city had been burned. Justinian ordered a new church to be constructed, greater than any that had stood before. Architects Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus designed a structure of daring ambition. Its dome seemed to float upon light, supported by hidden arches and half-domes, glittering with mosaics that reflected golden light across its interior. When Justinian first entered upon its completion, he is said to have exclaimed, "O Solomon, I have surpassed thee." For centuries it would stand as the greatest church in Christendom, its vast dome a symbol of the emperor's power and piety. But Justinian's reign was not limited to buildings. He was determined to restore the empire's former territories. His generals carried out campaigns that reshaped the Mediterranean world. Belisarius, his most trusted general, reconquered North Africa from the Vandals in a swift campaign. Carthage, once the rival of Rome, was brought back under imperial control. Later, Belisarius marched into Italy, battling the Ostrogoths. The wars dragged on for years, devastating much of the peninsula, but eventually Rome and Ravenna were retaken. For a brief moment it seemed that the Roman Empire, in its ancient form, might truly be reborn. Spain too saw Byzantine armies land upon its shores, establishing outposts along the Mediterranean coast. Yet these conquests came at great cost. The treasury was drained, soldiers were stretched thin, and the reconquered lands were often unstable, plagued by rebellion or foreign invasion. The dream of restoration was dazzling, but it proved difficult to sustain. Justinian was also a lawgiver. His most enduring legacy may not be the wars or the buildings, but the codification of Roman law into what is known as the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law. Lawyers, scribes and scholars labored under his direction to collect, organize and refine the vast mass of legal texts accumulated over centuries. The result was a coherent body of law that would influence Europe for 1,000 years. In its pages were principles of contracts, property, inheritance and justice, written in a way that students of law would continue to study even in the modern era. Amidst these achievements, the empire also endured suffering. In 541, during Justinian's reign, the Great Plague struck. It is often called the Plague of Justinian, though he himself survived it. The disease, likely bubonic plague carried by fleas on rats, spread through the crowded streets of Constantinople. Ships carried it across the Mediterranean. Victims were seized by fever, swelling, and delirium. Procopius described corpses piled in the streets, carts carrying away the dead, and whole households wiped out. In Constantinople alone, it is said that tens of thousands died, perhaps as many as half the population. The plague returned in waves for 2 centuries, weakening the empire and altering its demography. Imagine the silence of the streets when the plague was at its height. Markets closed, families locked themselves inside, and the sound of funeral processions echoed again and again. Priests offered prayers, doctors applied treatments of herbs or charms, but little could stop the tide of death. And yet, life continued. Survivors buried the dead, merchants reopened stalls, soldiers returned to their posts, and the empire carried on. Through all of this, Justinian ruled, often from behind the walls of the great palace, sometimes bedridden with illness, always absorbed in the tasks of empire. Without Theodora, his governance lacked the same balance, but his determination did not falter. He continued to issue decrees, oversee construction, and plan campaigns. He remained on the throne until 565, ruling for nearly 4 decades in total. When he died, he was buried in the Church of the Holy Apostles alongside his wife, Theodora. His reign left behind monuments, laws, and memories. But for those who lived under his rule, it was a time of both greatness and hardship. Taxes were heavy, wars were long, and plague was merciless. Yet the empire survived, and in many ways was strengthened. Theodora, though gone, remained present in memory. Her convents for women continued, her influence on laws protecting women endured, and her image in Ravenna still gazed calmly upon the faithful. Justinian never took another wife, never sought another partner to share the throne. His devotion to her memory, even in her absence, was itself a quiet testimony to the bond they had shared. And so, as the century moved on, the Byzantine Empire remained. A vast realm of stone cities, fertile lands, soldiers, priests, merchants, and peasants. Life went on in Constantinople much as it always had. Bread baked at dawn, ships arrived at the harbours, the hippodrome filled with shouts of blues and greens, and the dome of Hagia Sophia glowed in the morning light. Beneath all of it lay the memory of Justinian and Theodora, the emperor who sought to restore Rome and the empress who rose from the shadows to stand at his side. Their story is not one of simple triumph, but of endurance, ambition, suffering, and memory. It is a story best told slowly, step by step, as one might walk the long colonnades of a Byzantine palace or trace the quiet mosaics in the dim light of a church. It is a story that ends, as all do, in silence, but whose echoes continue across the centuries, carried in stone, in lore, and in legend. And so the long chapter of Justinian's later reign closes, as the city of Constantinople settles once more into the rhythms of daily life. Bread, water, prayer, and the slow march of history. Let us return once again to the city of Constantinople, that marble jewel on the Bosporus, not through the lens of battles or great councils, but through the slow, steady rhythm of daily life that stretched across years. If we are to understand the empire after Theodora's passing, we must walk not only through palaces and cathedrals, but also through streets, harbours, barracks and baths. The empire was, after all, not only an emperor and his decrees, but also hundreds of thousands of lives, each bound into the web of the city. The city could be imagined as a collection of districts, each with its own flavour, though bound together by the endless stone walls that embraced them. Within the Theodosian walls lay dozens of neighbourhoods. In some, artisans clustered, smiths hammering metal in darkened workshops, potters turning clay wheels, glassmakers blowing molten bubbles into shimmering vessels. In others, fishermen's families lived close to the harbours, where boats rocked against piers and the smell of salt and fish never left the air. Still other districts belonged to the wealthy, with houses of stone, courtyards planted with fig trees, and servants hurrying along with jugs of water or baskets of food. The markets or agoras were crowded with stalls. In the Forum of Constantine, merchants laid out silks that shimmered in the morning light, brought now not only from the east, but from secret workshops within the empire itself. Spices were displayed in baskets: cinnamon, pepper, saffron. These scents mingled with the smell of roasted meat, fresh bread and fish. A visitor might pass stalls selling icons painted on wood, or jewellery fashioned from gold and silver. The noise was constant, bargaining, shouting, donkeys braying, and bells chiming from nearby churches. Harbours bustled as well. The city possessed multiple ports, including the Great Bosporus Harbour and the Neairian Harbour, where ships from across the Mediterranean unloaded their cargo. From Egypt came grain, from Syria, wine and oil, from the Black Sea, timber and wax. The harbour was a forest of masts, sails, ropes and shouting sailors. Stevedores carried crates, amphorae and sacks. Custom officials recorded goods, collected duty and ensured the emperor's treasury swelled with each shipment. Without the harbours, the city would starve, for its population could not be fed by the nearby fields alone. If one wished to escape the noise of the harbour and markets, one might walk to the aqueducts, where arches of stone stretched across the landscape. Water, collected from distant hills, was carried into the city and stored in massive cisterns beneath the earth. The most famous, the Basilica cistern, held its forest of marble columns in the dim underground. Torches reflected in the still water, and the atmosphere was cool, damp, and eternal. The cisterns meant that even in drought or siege, the city could drink. Few cities in the world had such foresight. Above ground, the Hippodrome remained the great arena of the people. Even after the Nika riots, after the fires that had scarred the city, the Hippodrome continued to fill with thousands of voices. Blues and Greens, the rival chariot factions, still cheered their teams, though the emperor's watchful eyes ensured their rivalries did not erupt into rebellion again. The Hippodrome was more than sport. It was a theatre of politics. An emperor might be cheered or jeered. Crowds might shout petitions, demand tax relief or voice discontent. It was in these races lasting hours that the pulse of the city could be measured. The Great Palace, meanwhile, continued as the seat of government. Its halls were filled with courtiers, eunuchs, guards and scribes. Ceremonies were endless. Justinian himself, now older and wearier, still processed through its corridors in jewelled robes, though his stride was slower. The absence of Theodora was felt, but the machinery of rule continued. Decrees were issued, taxes collected, ambassadors received. Let us slow down further, for it is in the details that the true texture of life emerges. Soldiers patrolled the walls, inspecting towers, oiling weapons, watching the horizon for threats. Priests chanted in churches, incense rising with the hymns. Children played in alleys, tossing carved wooden toys, chasing each other between shadows of stone. Beggars sat by gates, hands outstretched, sometimes singing hymns for alms. Dogs roamed, sniffing for scraps. Donkeys trudged with heavy loads, bells marked hours, and the call of clergy echoed from Hagia Sophia's massive dome. The construction of Hagia Sophia itself, though completed years before, remained a marvel studied and admired. Builders had raised scaffolds higher than any before. Columns had been taken from temples across the empire, green marble from Thessaly, porphyry from Egypt, black stone from the Bosporus. Bricks had been made to exact specifications. Mortar, a mixture of lime and crushed brick, bound the structure. Engineers devised hidden systems of support, piers, buttresses and half-domes absorbing the weight of the central dome. Light filtered through 40 windows at its base, making it appear to float. Mercesisis climbed scaffolds to set pieces of gold, glass and stone into patterns of crosses, vines and angels. When finished, the church glowed like the heavens themselves captured in stone. Every visitor, even centuries later, marvelled at its light. Yet while glory was built in stone, death crept in shadows. The plague, beginning in 541, returned in waves. Imagine once again the streets, bodies carried on carts, pits dug outside the walls to receive the dead, priests offering last rites over endless processions. Families locked themselves inside, hoping to escape contagion. Merchants shuttered shops, silence fell upon markets. And then slowly survivors emerged, life resumed, and the city went on. Such was the rhythm: death, mourning, survival, repetition. The army too deserves attention. Soldiers were recruited from across the empire, Thracians, Illyrians, Armenians, and others. They carried spears, swords and shields painted with Christian symbols. Cavalry was especially valued, armoured in mail or scale, riding horses bred for strength. The navy guarded the seas, triremes and dramans patrolling coasts equipped with sails, oars and sometimes the fearsome Greek fire. Officers drilled men daily. Barracks echoed with the sound of shields clashing, orders shouted, and footsteps on packed earth. Campaigns were long and difficult, but the army remained the spine of the empire. Justinian's laws, meanwhile, reached every corner of life. Contracts were written in precise terms. What land could be sold, what debts must be paid, how inheritance would be divided. Marriage laws protected women more than before, some thanks to Theodora's influence. Crimes were punished according to categories, with punishments ranging from fines to exile, mutilation, or execution. The law, though harsh at times, provided order. Judges, scribes, and advocates made their living interpreting and applying it. The law books, bound in leather, copied by hand, spread through the empire. As the years stretched on, Justinian grew old. His hair whitened, his health faltered, but he clung to the throne. He lived within routines, audiences with officials, prayers in Hagia Sophia, occasional appearances at the Hippodrome. He was emperor until the end, ruling through decrees and the machinery of bureaucracy. When he died in 565, the empire was weary but still whole, still strong. And after his death, life in Constantinople continued much as before. Bread was baked at dawn, ships docked in harbours, markets opened. Children played, priests prayed, walls stood watch. The dome of Hagia Sophia glowed in morning light. The empire, like the city, endured slow and steady through time. There are moments in history when time seems to slow, when each day carries the weight of years, and when the ordinary rhythms of life are interrupted by silence, mourning, and dread. For the Byzantine Empire in the mid-6th century, that moment came with the plague. The plague did not arrive with fanfare. It slipped into the empire aboard ships, hidden in the bodies of rats and the bite of fleas. At first it was only rumour, whispers of sickness in far-off towns, merchants murmuring of strange deaths along the coast. Then, in the year 541, it reached the capital. Constantinople, with its crowded streets, its bustling harbours, and its 500,000 souls, became the stage upon which one of history's most terrifying epidemics played out. The city had always been noisy. The cries of market vendors, the clatter of carts, the braying of donkeys, the shouts of children, the hammering of artisans, all blended into a constant hum. But as the plague spread, those sounds faded. Shops shuttered, workshops closed, the hippodrome fell silent. The air itself seemed heavy, as though waiting for something unseen. Symptoms appeared suddenly. A man might wake in the morning feeling well, and by evening be gripped by fever, shivering, and weakness. Swellings called buboes rose under the arms or in the groin, tender and hot. Some victims slipped into delirium, speaking in fragments, thrashing in their beds. Others became strangely calm, as though preparing themselves for departure. Death could come within days, sometimes within hours. The streets filled with the sick. Those who could no longer walk lay upon doorsteps or by fountains. Families tried to tend to their own, but when entire households fell ill, there was no one left to bring water or bread. Priests moved among them, offering prayers and blessings, swinging censers of incense in the hope that the smoke might drive away the contagion. Doctors applied poultices of herbs, lanced swellings or prescribed potions of wine and spices, but few treatments worked. At first the dead were carried to cemeteries outside the walls. Processions moved slowly, mourners carrying bodies wrapped in linen, priests chanting, candles flickering even in daylight. But as numbers grew, the cemeteries overflowed. Trenches were dug, great pits into which corpses were lowered. Some were stacked in layers, separated by thin layers of earth. The smell grew unbearable. Procopius, the historian, wrote that the stench of death hung over the city like a fog. Imagine walking the streets in those days. The doors of many houses were closed, silent. Others stood open, revealing bodies within. Carts creaked along, piled high with the dead, driven by men whose faces were wrapped in cloth soaked with vinegar. Dogs prowled, hungry and restless. The air was still, punctuated only by the tolling of bells and the cries of grief. And yet, not all was despair. Life clung stubbornly to its routines. Bakers still baked, though fewer loaves emerged from the ovens. The harbour still received ships, though crews were thinned. Some markets reopened in cautious hours, merchants whispering their prices, buyers keeping their distance. The empire's officials, despite their losses, still attempted to keep order. Guards patrolled, scribes recorded, and tax collectors, though fewer in number, still sought their due. The plague did not pass quickly. For months it raged, retreating only to return again in later years. Some said it was punishment from God, a test of faith, or a sign of the end times. Others searched for earthly explanations. The alignment of stars, the corruption of air, the spreading of invisible seeds of disease. Few understood the true cause, and so fear grew all the stronger. Even Justinian himself was stricken. The emperor, already aged and weary, fell ill with fever and sweat. For days he lingered between life and death, his court whispering of succession, officials wondering if the empire itself might collapse. But he recovered. His survival was seen by some as a miracle, by others as a sign of divine favor. Yet though he lived, he emerged thinner, paler, and older than before. His strength diminished. The impact of the plague reached beyond the city. Villages in the countryside were emptied, fields lay untended, and harvests rotted. Armies lost soldiers not to battle but to sickness. Campaigns faltered. Revenues declined, for fewer men remained to pay taxes. The empire, though vast and strong, was shaken to its foundation, and still, as in all human history, survivors rebuilt. Pits were filled, streets were swept, markets reopened. Children, those who had endured, once again played in alleys. Priests gave thanks for deliverance. The hippodrome filled again. Though the cheers were weaker, life resumed, but it was not the same. The memory of death lingered, etched into the city's stones, carried in the minds of those who had seen entire families vanish in days. Let us pause to consider the ordinary people, for they carried the heaviest burden. A fisherman's boat might return with no one to haul the nets. A potter's wheel might sit silent, its owner gone. A mother might wake to find her children fevered, helpless to save them. A priest might chant over dozens of burials each day until his voice cracked. A gravedigger might swing his shovel endlessly, earth and sweat mixing, until exhaustion overcame him. Each life was altered, each story interrupted, and yet the empire endured. It endured because people, in their quiet determination, carried on. Survivors tilled fields, rebuilt shops, taught children, mended nets, and sang hymns. They carried with them both grief and resilience. When the plague at last receded, Constantinople returned slowly to its rhythms. The harbour once more echoed with sailors' shouts, the markets with bargaining, the hippodrome with cheers. But beneath it all lay the silence of those who were gone. The empire had been diminished, but it had not fallen. Justinian continued to rule, his decrees issued, his projects pursued, his laws enforced. Hagia Sophia still stood, its dome glowing in morning light. And so, the chapter of the plague closes not with triumph, but with survival. It is a reminder that history is not only of emperors and generals, but also of countless unnamed souls who lived, suffered, and endured. Their names are lost, their voices silent, but their endurance carried the empire forward. Thus, the story of the plague becomes part of the greater story of Byzantium. A time of suffering, yes, but also of resilience, memory, and the slow return to ordinary life. The bells of Hagia Sophia rang once more. The bread was baked at dawn, and the city of Constantinople, scarred but unbroken, continued its long march through history. The plague had passed, though its shadows remained upon the city of Constantinople for many years. The great metropolis, once vibrant with merchants, soldiers, artisans, and pilgrims, now stood in a quieter state. Streets that had once carried the echo of thousands of footsteps were subdued. Yet life has a way of returning, slowly and reluctantly, and even in the great Byzantine capital, the ordinary rhythms of daily existence crept back. Farmers began to drive their carts of grain toward the city gates once more. The marketplace, though still smaller than in earlier times, reopened its stalls. Fishermen continued to sail upon the Bosporus, casting their nets and returning to the harbours where silent gulls waited. The Emperor Justinian, though weakened by his own struggle with illness, did not allow his vision of empire to fade. He believed himself chosen for a task that reached beyond his lifetime. His mission was not only to preserve the empire, but to restore it to the greatness of old Rome. In his chambers, attended by eunuchs, priests and physicians, he turned his thoughts again to law and governance. For Justinian, law was the structure that held society together, and he knew the empire could not rise again upon uncertain foundations. The Codex Justinianus had been completed earlier, but its use was not yet universal. In the years following the plague, the emperor ordered his officials to carry copies throughout the provinces. From Antioch to Alexandria, from Thessalonica to Ravenna, the revised code was meant to bring order. The laws were written upon heavy parchment and bound into volumes that clerks carried carefully. These books became the voice of the emperor in towns where his face was never seen. Within them were decrees that touched every part of life: property, trade, inheritance, marriage and crime. For the ordinary citizen, the laws might seem distant, but their influence spread quietly, like roots beneath the soil, binding the empire together. The heart of the city remained the Hagia Sophia, the vast church whose dome seemed to hang miraculously in the air. It had been completed in the wake of destruction after the Nika riots, and now, after the plague, it stood as a sign that even tragedy could be followed by renewal. Worshippers returned slowly, some hesitant, others with gratitude that they had survived. Candles flickered against golden mosaics, filling the vast interior with a shimmering glow. Priests chanted softly, their voices echoing against the marble walls. Those who entered felt both the majesty of the empire and the frailty of life, for they remembered how easily death had come upon the city. Beyond the church, artisans resumed their work. Mosaic makers pressed coloured tiles into place upon new walls and chapels. Stone carvers shaped capitals for columns, working slowly with hammer and chisel. Blacksmiths returned to their forges, striking iron into tools and weapons. Weavers once again produced cloth, setting up their looms in small workshops. These acts of labour, though humble, were the true measure of recovery. An empire lives not only in palaces and armies, but in the daily persistence of its people. In the army too, there was slow rebuilding. The plague had thinned the ranks of soldiers, and fortresses along the borders had been left vulnerable. Messengers carried word of raids and incursions, and Justinian ordered new levies to be raised. Men from the countryside were drawn into service. Horses were gathered, armour repaired, and ships fitted for sailing once again. The empire could not rest while its enemies watched. Across the Danube, tribes pressed against the frontier. In the east, the Persians still measured the empire's weakness. Every soldier returning to camp was both a sign of survival and a reminder of loss. Life in the markets reflected the gradual recovery of confidence. Grain from Egypt once again filled the granary. Olive oil, wine, and honey began to circulate more freely. Traders arrived from distant lands, bringing spices, silks, and precious stones. Prices were high, for scarcity still lingered, but people returned to bargaining, to haggling, to the familiar dance of commerce. In the narrow streets, children once again played, their laughter a contrast to the heavy silence of plague years. Dogs barked, donkeys brayed, and life stitched itself together thread by thread. The emperor's officials, too, worked diligently to restore order. Tax collectors resumed their duties, though many citizens complained of the burden. The treasury had been depleted, wars had been costly, and reconstruction demanded more. Scribes filled scrolls with records of payments, their ink marking the slow return of administration. Judges heard cases in local courts, applying Justinian's laws to disputes both small and large. Some of these cases concerned inheritance, as families had been broken by the plague. Others dealt with land, for fields had been left untended and boundaries uncertain. Through these judgments, the empire sought stability, even as grief remained in memory. Religious devotion deepened after the plague. Monasteries grew in number, with men and women retreating from the world to seek prayer and contemplation. For some, the experience of widespread death was a reminder of the vanity of earthly life. Pilgrims traveled to holy sites, offering candles and coins, praying for mercy upon their families. Priests preached of divine judgment and divine mercy, urging repentance. Yet within the city there was also resilience. Festivals resumed, though more subdued. Processions wound through the streets carrying icons, banners, and relics as choirs sang hymns to the saints who were believed to protect the city. Theodora's absence was felt deeply. She had died before the plague struck, and her voice no longer guided Justinian. Yet her influence remained, for the reforms she had championed continued to shape society. Laws protecting women from exploitation and granting them greater rights in property and inheritance were still in force. Her memory lingered in the palace halls, in whispers among the servants, and in the gratitude of those who had benefited from her compassion. For Justinian, her death had left a void that could not be filled, and yet he carried forward the mission they had once shared. As years passed, Constantinople regained its stature, though never without scars. The city was like a ship battered by storm, patched and repaired, still afloat but bearing marks of survival. The empire endured even as challenges continued. New roads were built, aqueducts repaired, and fortifications strengthened. The bureaucracy worked to keep records, to collect taxes, to send orders across the provinces. The machinery of empire turned slowly, but it turned, and in that steady motion lay the essence of Byzantine endurance. And so in the quiet years after the plague, Byzantium continued its long journey. Life did not return at once, nor did grief vanish quickly, but the people of the city, bound together by faith, by law, and by the memory of their trials, lived on. The empire's story was far from finished, for storms and struggles yet awaited. But in those years of slow recovery, the spirit of Constantinople was revealed, not in grand victories or sudden triumphs, but in the ordinary persistence of living, working, and believing that tomorrow would still come. An empire is never rebuilt by decrees alone, it is rebuilt by hands. In the markets, commerce expanded slowly but steadily. The Mies, the great thoroughfare of the city, once again grew busy with stalls and shoppers. Merchants offered wine in clay jars, olives in woven baskets, fish salted and packed for storage. Foreign traders brought goods from distant lands, silk from the east, spices from India, furs from the north. Haggling returned, the familiar back and forth of price and demand. Children wove between stalls, carrying errands for their families. Beggars extended hands, some missing kin lost to the plague. Over it all, the sound of voices filled the air, a chorus of languages and accents, as Constantinople reminded itself that it was not merely a city, but a world within walls. Yet not all was renewal. The plague had left deep marks upon the army. Garrison after garrison had been thinned. Fields along the Danube saw villages abandoned, their men either dead or weakened. From the east, Persia watched, ever ready to test the borders. Justinian's generals worked to recruit new soldiers, calling upon farmers and herdsmen to serve. Horses were gathered, weapons repaired, fortresses staffed once more. Drills took place upon dusty fields, men marching, turning, raising shields, thrusting spears. Trumpets sounded commands. Armor gleamed under the sun, but behind the discipline lay a fragile truth. Many of the men were new, untested, their strength uncertain. The empire held the line not with abundance but with determination. The navy, too, returned to its waters. Ships known as dramans, long and sleek, were fitted again with sails and oars. Crews gathered, learning to row in unison, to turn sharply, to carry fire and weapons across the waves. From the harbours of Constantinople, they patrolled the Bosporus, guarding against raiders and smugglers. The sea was lifeblood to the empire, carrying grain from Egypt, goods from Africa, and trade from the Black Sea. Without it, the city could not live. As the years moved forward, daily rhythms established themselves again. Tax collectors resumed their duties, walking from door to door with tablets in hand. Farmers outside the city measured their harvests, calculating what portion would be kept and what portion sent. Judges heard disputes over property and inheritance, which had multiplied in the wake of so much death. Priests baptized infants born after the plague, new voices crying in homes where silence had reigned. Life pressed forward, though none forgot the years when death had filled every street. Festivals returned in quieter forms. The Hippodrome, though once the roaring heart of the city, no longer filled as it had. The blues and greens still marched in procession, their banners raised, but the crowds were smaller, the voices softer. Where once tens of thousands had gathered, now seats stood empty, reminders of lives lost. Yet the races continued, chariots circling the track, horses pounding the earth, wheels rattling, as though to insist that tradition survived. Children cheered from the stands, eyes wide, not knowing the sorrow their parents remembered. Religious devotion deepened. Monasteries multiplied in the countryside, where men and women withdrew from the city, seeking a life of prayer. Hermits settled upon rocky hillsides, their shelters little more than huts, their lives dedicated to fasting and contemplation. Within Constantinople, processions wound through the streets, icons raised high, hymns sung in steady rhythm. Citizens joined, holding candles, stepping slowly, their voices uniting in prayer for protection. For them, the city's survival was not only the work of emperors and generals, but of divine mercy. And in the palace, Justinian aged. His hair grew thin, his face lined, his steps slower, but he did not retreat. Surrounded by eunuchs and advisors, he continued to dictate decrees, to hear reports, to send ambassadors. Maps were unrolled before him, showing provinces stretched across 3 continents. Messengers came and went, bringing word from borders, from governors, from generals. The emperor listened, questioned, decided. His hands shook at times, but his will did not. He saw himself as servant of God, charged with holding together the Roman legacy until his final breath. The memory of Theodora lingered always. She had been gone for years, yet her presence seemed carved into the palace itself. Justinian remembered her counsel, her courage, her defiance during the Nika revolt. In quiet moments, perhaps walking in the palace gardens, he thought of her words, her laughter, the strength she had given him. Though absent, she remained his partner in memory. To the people too, her reforms endured. Women found greater security in marriage, in property, in protection from exploitation. Even those who never saw her face lived under laws shaped by her hand. Thus the empire endured. Not through sudden triumphs or sweeping victories, but through persistence. Byzantium lived on in its markets, its churches, its armies, its households. The city scarred by plague carried forward its daily rhythm, carts rattling, bells ringing, waves lapping against harbour walls. The Hagia Sophia rose above it all, a dome above a people who had seen ruin and yet refused to vanish. And so, through years of slow recovery, Byzantium held firm. The world around it shifted, tribes and kingdoms rose and fell, but within its walls, life continued. The empire was not unshaken, but it was unbroken. In its endurance lay its identity, a reminder that civilizations do not only shine in glory, but also in survival. The story of Byzantium was far from over, and in its long unfolding, these years of recovery formed a chapter not of conquest, but of resilience.